Right now it's time to do a little more practice. So I've written a few examples on the board, and what I would like you to do is take a moment to write down these questions and then try to come up with the answer. We're going to go over these a little bit because some of them were a little tricky. So let's see. Hopefully you got the correct answer for the first one. This second one, I imagine, might have caused you a little bit of trouble. So the important thing was to remember, you go from a whole step above G to A sharp, and then a whole step above A sharp takes you to B sharp. Now remember, the B sharp is enharmonic with C, but we're calling it B sharp, and to raise it a half step to make it augmented, we need a B double sharp. Probably you have never given a B double sharp any thought before today. After all, B sharp was probably a stretch for you a week ago, but in this case we're using a B double sharp, and that gives us our augmented third. I don't imagine you had too much trouble with this one, or this one. I want you to notice here, this flat goes to the left, and because when you have a second, the notes are too close together, we don't write them like that. Even though here these two would be played probably at the same time, we write them beside each other because with a second there isn't room to write the notes one above the other the way that we do with other intervals. However, the accidental goes to the left of both notes. So this flat here corresponds to this B, not to this A, but it still goes to the left because there's no room to put it in between. We're implying that these two notes are happening simultaneously. This is a good reminder of why it's very important to put your flat or sharp on the same line or space as the note that you want to be raised or lowered. Because if I put my flat up here, or even just one line in the wrong direction, I would have had the wrong answer. This one hopefully didn't give you too much trouble, or this one, or this one. Hopefully the rest of these you got correct. But if not, I encourage you to go back and double check and try to figure out why you got the incorrect answer. On occasion, especially on your homework, you might see something like this. And of course this might be confusing. What I wanted to point out, you have a natural that applies to the first note and a flat that applies to the second note. We would actually call this interval a diminished unison because it was a unison and now it's like the second note is dipping into negative space. So this would be a diminished unison, and you might find these. Another thing I wanted to point out is that sometimes people wonder why they can't use the minor scale to build minor intervals since they can use the major scale to build major intervals. And there is a reason for that. Think about a minor scale. The very first interval you have is a whole step, the same as in a major scale. So obviously not all of the intervals in a minor scale are minor intervals. Only some of them are. And that's why we always start with the major scale, even if we're building a minor interval. So don't get confused on that point. So far, we've learned about ascending intervals. That is, intervals going up, so starting from a bottom note and going to the top note. And it's pretty easy to find an interval above a note. The challenge comes when you're asked to find an interval below a note. Now you might think, well, why can't I just go backward down the major scale pattern and go like this? Whole, whole, half. Well, because that doesn't make a major scale pattern. right? Because when we think of the major scale, it ends with a half step, not a whole step, etc. So, although you could memorize the backward major scale pattern, that's a lot of work. There's a much easier way to figure out a descending interval, and I'm going to tell you what it is. The first thing you need to know is that every interval has an inversion. What I mean by an inversion is that you can take any interval and by flipping it upside down, you make its inversion. This right here is a perfect fifth. If I take the D and put the D on the bottom, now I have a perfect fourth. Every interval has an inversion that's created just by flipping that interval upside down. So thinking about that, if you wanted to build a descending interval, what you would want to do is build its inversion first and then just flip it upside down. Now, let's get some practice with what I mean in real terms. First of all, the numbers between an interval and its inversion, they always add up to 9. So, a unison inverts to an octave. 1 plus 8 equals 9. A second will invert to what? A seventh. A third will invert to a sixth. And a fourth will invert to a fifth. And then, of course, the opposite is true as well. A fifth to a fourth, a sixth to a third, a seventh to a second, and so on. So anytime you want to build an interval, the first thing to remember if you're building a descending interval is that the interval and its inversion, the numeric part of the interval, will add up to 9, the interval and its inversion. So if I asked you to build a descending sixth, you could build me an ascending third, and then write the note you got below. For example, if I asked you for a sixth below C, you could write a third above C, C, D, E, and then just write the E instead of writing it here. Write the E down there. And look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now we have a sixth. So that takes care of the generic portion of the interval, that is, or otherwise known as the numeric portion. You just need to figure out what the inversion is. Now with equality, the important thing is to know perfect intervals invert to perfect intervals. Major intervals invert to minor intervals, and diminished intervals invert to augmented intervals. So if I were to ask you for the inversion of a major seventh, what would that be? A minor second. Very good. And if I asked for the inversion of a perfect fourth, what would that be? A perfect fifth. Very good. And if I asked you for the inversion of an augmented sixth, what would that be? A diminished third.